B1 family, welcome to Blacklogic. Our ancestors were brought to this country, this land rather, before it was even a country, back in the early 1500s, 1526 to be exact. And they were forced to work in the most brutal conditions known to men. And they were enslaved for over 200 years. And during that time, they built the foundation of America in a number of ways. But before we pinpoint a lot of the ways in which they built America, let's get one thing correct: the lineage of slavery in America and when it first started. Now, you can point out some of Henry Gates' work dating back to 1513, when the first free Black person in America came with some Spanish conquistadors looking for the fountain of youth. But better yet, let's start here. It states in the second paragraph, second sentence, most obviously, 1619 was not the first time Africans could be found in an English Atlantic colony. And it certainly wasn't the first time people of African descent made their mark and imposed their will on the land that will someday be part of the United States. And what that implies is that Black people were already here prior to 1619 and as well prior in 1526. It goes on to say, as early as May 1616, Blacks from the West Indies were already at work in Bermuda, providing expert knowledge about the cultivation of tobacco, meaning they already knew and already had the knowledge and wisdom to cultivate and grow those crops. There is also suggestive evidence that scores of Africans plundered from the Spanish were aboard a fleet under the command of Sir Francis Drake when he arrived at Roanoke Island in 1586. In 1526, enslaved Africans were part of a Spanish expedition to establish an outpost on the North American coast in present-day South Carolina. Those Africans launched a rebellion in November of that year, effectively destroying the Spanish settlers' ability to sustain settlement, which they abandoned a year later. Nearly 100 years before Jamestown, African actors established and able American colonies to survive, and they were equally able to destroy European colonial ventures. See, one of the most important ways that Black states built the foundation of America was through their slave labor. And again, to double down on the fact, it states here, nor it is the case that who arrived in 1619 were the first enslaved people in what became the United States in 1565, for example. The Spanish brought enslaved Africans to present-day St. Augustine, Florida, the first European settlement in what's now the continental U.S. in 1526. A Spanish expedition to present-day South Carolina was thwarted when the enslaved Africans aboard resisted. They revolted. They rebelled, right? In addition, indigenous people, notably those of the 30-odd tribal communities led by Ponto's father Pohanta, lived in the area that became Virginia long before Europeans or Africans got there. The English settlers enslaved indigenous people around the time of 1619, and some colonies later owned both American Indian and African slaves, okay? So when we look at these things, we understand that our people, they were enforced to work long hours in the fields and plantation and in mines. The British arrived. They faced a harsh and foreboding wilderness, and their lives became little more than a struggle for survival because they didn't know the land. They didn't know how to survive on the land. So to make settling the land more attractive, the Virginia Company offered any adult man with the means to travel to America 50 acres of land. But wait, look how this unfolds. At the encouragement of the company, many of the settlers banded together and created large settlements called hundreds, and they were intended to support 100 individuals, usually men who led a household. So this was like townships that they created. It states that the hundreds were run as private plantation, intent on making a profit from the cultivation of crops, which the economy of the South depended on. The climate of the South was ideally suited to the cultivation of cash crops. Unlike small subsistence farms, plantations were created to grow cash crops for sale on the market. The plantation system was an early capitalist venture. England's King James had every intention of profiting from plantation, tobacco, cotton, and rice to be exceptionally profitable, especially when they are taxed. Therefore, cheap labor was used. Initially, indentured servants who were mostly from England and sometimes Africa, northern, and enslaved African less often. Indigenous people, meaning the Native Americans, didn't work until the land under slavery or an indentured servitude. It stated that indentured servants were contracted to work 4 to 7 years, terms without pay for passage to the colonial room and board. And after completing the term, they were often given land, clothes, and provisions. So don't let anyone tell you that our ancestors were indentured servants. We were never given land, clothes, and provision, meaning money to build on the land. We understand that our ancestors, our forefathers, their labor built the infrastructure of this country, including roads, bridges, and canals. They also built the foundation to grow the economy by producing crops such as cotton, tobacco, and rice. Without the slave labor of our ancestors, the United States would have not become the most powerful nation it is today. So when we think about the railroad, most people go directly to the Chinese. But what most people won't tell you is that these railroads was being built as early as 1840s. Now, this is a small synopsis and a snapshot of before the Chinese actually were even allowed to work the railroad. And we'll get deep into that as well. It states here the building of America's railroad involved Black Americans, many working as slaves. Virtually every railroad built in the pre-emancipation era South was built using slave labor. And let it be known that no Chinese person in this country was ever a slave. During the Civil War, 1861 and 1865, the U.S. military railroads employed thousands of freemen and contraband slaves, as seen here. Besides those who worked on the transcontinental railroad, tens of thousands of Black Americans worked in the railroad industry and thereafter. Railroad and mining employment, unlike sharecropping and domestic service, offered a more economically independent life for Black Americans. Black American railroad workers helped build the nation we know today. Of course they did. And when we dive here just a little bit deeper, family, the growth of slavery and Southern railroad development. As you see here, Jordan Cotton Production, 1860. But as we get into the details, it states that by 1860, the South was the third leading railroad nation in the world, trailing only the Northern United States and the United Kingdom in total miles constructed. It contained 33% of the nation's railroad mileage and 40% of its population, and Southern states were aggressively promoting railroad development through the 1850s. That means they started in the 1840s and throughout the 1850s. It also goes on to say, indeed, Southern railroads built and maintained their roads with enslaved labor, orchestrating contacts for hire on a scale of complexity and the cost that seemed logical and consistent with the purpose, but far in excess of any other institutions. Railroads began buying hundreds of male slaves. Listen, railroads began buying hundreds of male slaves between the ages of 16 and 35 as early as 1841. 1841, and we have to put into reference that the Chinese didn't start helping build the railroad until the early 1860s, okay? So 1841. And in 1850s, were either renting or buying hands in groups of 100. One president of the Mississippi Central Railroad explained to his stockholders in 1855, I am led to the irresistible conclusion that in case of management, in economy of maintenance, and certain execution of work, and an amount of labor performed in absence of disturbance of riotous outbreaks, the slave is preferable to free labor and far better adapted to the construction of railroads in the South. Let's take a step further. Looking back, historians say The Chinese who began arriving in the United States in significant numbers during the California Gold Rush of 1848. Listen, don't forget 1841. Of 1848 to 1855. They were deemed too weak for the dangerous, strenuous jobs of building the railroad east from California. The associate director of the Chinese Railroad Workers and North American Project at Stanford University says the Central Pacific Railroad director, Charles Crockett, recommended hiring Chinese workers after a job and resulted in only a few hundred responses from white laborers. White workers whom the company wanted did not sign on in numbers anything close to what was needed, he says. Crockett's colleagues objected at first because of prejudice, but then relented as they had few other options. The idea of hiring Chinese, it appears, might have been raised first by Crockett's Chinese manservant. And why this is important, there were slaves in the West Coast, in California, in Washington, all over the United States of America, but they did not have as large numbers as they did in the South. So that's very notable to note. It states here, according to the Chinese Railroad Workers Project, Central Pacific started with a crew of 21 Chinese workers in January of 1864. So when the Chinese first came over here during the gold rush, they came over here to mine for gold for all these particular companies, but they did not get into help building the railroad up until 1863, 1864. It goes on to say, in January of 1865, convinced that Chinese workers were capable, the railroad hired 50 Chinese workers and then 50 more, the project notes. But the demand for labor increased and white workers were reluctant to do such backbreaking, hazardous work. This is what we're referring to as we built the very foundation of this country. Because in addition to our slave labor, Black slaves also are the cultural foundation of America. See, FBA family, our ancestors brought with them their own language and created their own languages, such as the Tut language, religions, the African ancestral spiritual religions, and custom, which helped to shape the diverse culture of the United States of America. They also created American music genres, such as blues, jazz, gospel, rock and roll, and hip hop. Black slaves also fought for their freedom and helped to shape the political foundation of America. They started slave rebellions and revolts, escaped to freedom on the Underground Railroad by the way of Harriet Tubman and others, and fought in the Civil War for their freedom. Their efforts helped to end slavery and to lay the foundation for a more just and equitable society. Black labor has been foundational to the growth of America and our economy. Enslaved people built the country's early infrastructure and produced lucrative commodities such as cotton and tobacco and rice as well. And after emancipation, Black American labor was crucial in the industries of agriculture and service. And yet, the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics, which was established in 1884, only started gathering consistent data on Black American workers in 1972. For nearly a century, Black American workers did not appear even as data points, let alone in meaningful policies, labor legislation. Skipping down to the third paragraph, Black workers have endured a long history of discrimination, including restrictions from unions. Companies use Black workers as strike breakers to misdirect white workers' anger and frustration. We were used as chess pieces, so to speak. We were used as pawns. We were easily disposable in these ways. New Deal program excluded Black agricultural and domestic workers. And in 1930s, progressive public benefit legislation, such as Social Security Act, was actually pro-white legislation that neglects Black workers, especially women. The contribution of Black slaves to the foundation of America are undeniable, family. The ancestors built the country with their labor, helped to shape its culture, and fought for their freedom. Our legacy is a reminder of the reparations owed to foundational Black Americans and the justice we fight for and deserve. Black workers' high labor force participation has propelled American economic growth, often at extremely low pay. Black slaves enduring brutal conditions for 2 centuries in southern plantations industries to build the booming American economy. In the early 1900s, over 1 million joined the Great Migration to fill jobs in the steel, automobile, shipbuilding, and other heavy industry. This pivotal moment of American capitalism, W.E.B. Du Bois states, the giant forces of water and steam were harnessed due to the world's work, and the Black workers of America bent at the bottom of a growing pyramid of commerce and industry. White employers underpaid and segregated Black workers, subjecting them to discrimination and hostility. We must recognize their labor, whether caring for children or turning out machines in a factory, as important parts of Americans' growth. So where are we today? Black workers make up a large part of the workforce and face record low unemployment. Skipping down to the third paragraph, racial disparities persist. Black graduates are nearly 10% points likelier to be employed in an occupation not requiring a college degree than their white peers. Staggering numbers of Black American workers experience workplace discrimination, and Black women are less likely to be promoted than men or other women. This leads to troubling outcomes. In 2017, Black men's wages were 69.7% of white men's, while Black women's wages were 60.8%. Despite broad historical gains in labor force participation in education attainment, our country still has a long way to go. And when we think of some specific examples of how Black slaves built the foundation of America, some of the most prominent things we think of is our ancestors building the White House, the Capitol building, and other economic landmarks. See, they laid the transcontinental railroad and built the canals that allow for the transportation of goods across the country and helped to connect the country and facilitate trade before the Chinese even got here. We cultivated the land and produced the crops that fed the nation. We were the first to work in the mines and helped to fuel the Industrial Revolution. That's right. We were the first to work in the mines and help to fuel the Industrial Revolution. From the mid-1700s, enslaved workers in coal pits of Richmond, Virginia, were among the first to work in America's commercial coal mines. Thrown into harsh labor conditions and exploitation, some of these miners managed to acquire skills and knowledge that would eventually give rise to a Black-led mining culture. One of the largest coal companies operating in Richmond, Virginia in the late 1830s was the Midlothian Mining Company, which used around 150 enslaved Black workers. After emancipation, industrializing Central Appalachia saw Black miners come closer to finding economic equality than in any other coal field. It goes on to say, during these mercurial times, Black miners increasingly organized themselves into unions to push for better working conditions and wages. One of the most notable events in the history of Black miners and unionization is the Miners' March of 1921 in West Virginia, where Black American miners made up a significant portion of the striking workforce. Correct, family. We have been in all facets of the infrastructure and building the wealth of this country. We created art, music, and literature that enriched the American culture. We fought in all the wars of this country, believe it or not. We fought in the Civil War and we helped to end slavery. There has been so much that our people have done. The contributions of Black slaves to the foundation of America are vast and varied. Our ancestors are a testament to the strength, resilience, and ingenuity of the American spirit. Their legacy is our legacy and is a reminder of the importance of what this country owed to us, the descendants of the American freedmen who built this country. Be one.